Thank you very much, Hayden and Joe and everyone tied to the Education Committee and the folks who brought the spring virtual meeting together. On a light note, I don't think I submitted it with Culturific's maps tagged this time, which would be a little strange if I did, because this is totally for me anyway, a governmental appearance. I don't think Culturific Maps is getting royalties off of this one, but I loved the intro. So yes, I'll go ahead and ring in today's broadband panel, which is really trying to bring this home to all of us as WLIA members. What does all this broadband buzz mean to us in the day-to-day lives of working as an LIO or as a county or local government or private sector GIS staffer? Certainly it's taking a lot of news, but at some point, where does it get into our nuts and bolts of our work? So the aim of our 5-person panel today is to go into that and bring that home to all of us. So as long as my slide transitions work right, click, perfect. So I'll do a proper introduction of all 5 of our panelists here on the next slide, but just to kind of bring this in a little bit, why does broadband matter? It probably goes without saying. We needed to get anything done these days. We don't have this meeting without it. We probably won't have a meeting ever again without it to some degree. I mean, we need it for advertising. We need it for, any virtual component we have, but as WLIA. But of course, zooming out to the more expanded scale here, working at it from 40,000 foot level, it drives education, it drives economic development, telehealth, standard work from home for everybody, especially in the era of COVID-19. Broadband impacts us everywhere, and it shakes up the fate of towns large and small throughout the state and across the country, as far as how well development goes on that local scale. So to bring this more specific to us as GISers, certainly with the pandemic, but certainly before the pandemic as well, we've been seeing an increasing tide of both communities and internet service providers, or ISPs as I'll refer to them throughout the rest of the talk. They and us citizens, us residents on an individual level, recognize that we need robust broadband coverage, and we need to start planning for that in order for deployment of internet to work successfully and not be a waste of tax dollars to go ahead and put infrastructure in the ground. Certainly, you've all heard, maybe not in great detail, but at least in light detail, the demand for more funding from the governmental side is definitely bringing a highlight on planning broadband expansion projects as well. I'll touch on that lightly in my presentation. Nick Anderson is going to talk about it as well in his. So that attention matters too. And really, in order to have a good comprehensive plan to deploy internet successfully and broadband infrastructure successfully across Wisconsin, the ISPs, broadband planners, us at the community level, I'm in state government, of course, we need high quality geospatial data to really plan this stuff out. And any of you folks who've been involved in Next Generation 911, which in one way or another are most of the people in this virtual room, you can probably understand pretty quickly that broadband, also a statewide issue, really should be another topic that dovetails with Next Gen 911, our parcel initiative, and other geospatial needs to help drive the mission of basically having better statewide data or better statewide foundational mapping layers for use across the geospatial community and the folks who benefit from our work. So to give more of an introduction to everyone who's giving a bit of a panel presentation today, the aim here, and we'll see how long I ramble and hopefully it doesn't throw the timing off too much. We're going to have 5 roughly 10 to 15 minute. If it runs a little shorter, fine. If it runs a little longer, maybe that's okay. Presentations from Nick, Andy, Garen, Zach, and myself on various parts of how the geospatial world intersects with broadband. A big part of why I'm excited about this, I think it's quintet is the word, of speakers, is that we're coming from quite different parts of the broadband deployment spectrum. And where, of course, a number of you have heard me talk about what's happening at the state broadband office at the Public Service Commission for a long time. And I've heard certain elements of some of my colleagues' talks here before. There's also going to be some very new stuff. I'm excited to hear from everyone, but in particular, both Garen and Zach are going to discuss a little bit of what is happening with geospatial data on the private sector side of broadband mapping. And I think that'll offer some insight, some rather new insight for us on the governmental side to really see how they're using data and how improved data collection techniques and improved data layers will be helpful across the board for all of us. So that is what you'll expect to see here in the next about hour and 20 minutes. Our goal is to have roughly 15 minutes left for questions at the end. Right now, if you want to put questions in the chat as the presentation goes on, feel free to do so, and we will probably circle back to those at the end. But certainly we'd like to open it up to forum at the end of this as well. So for the sake of getting there, I'm going to keep going here. As I mentioned, there'll be roughly 5 lightning talks followed by that Q&A. I'll go ahead and go first, representing the state's Public Service Commission, and I'll discuss what we've been doing basically on a state-led planning and broadband expansion grant point of view. And a big thing I'll lean on is our evolving state of broadband coverage mapping. Garen with Norvado will talk about in more of a finer detail how an internet service provider or an ISP takes in geospatial data and works within their own business model to basically help maintain the work of an ISP with GIS data. Andy with the Regional Planning Commission, of course, will point out, and especially with his expertise on the Next Gen 911 topic, will point out some ways where it'd be really helpful if we can further implement statewide mapping layers and layers that maybe aren't quite statewide yet into the broadband mapping process. Nick, representing the Ho-Chunk Nation, will talk about some of the work that he and his colleagues have to do to navigate the plethora of federal and state programs for broadband expansion, how mapping gets into that, especially with the specific point of view that he has coming from a tribal community. And Zach with Ayers, lastly, will show at a very fine scale how they're using GIS to support some of their clients as far as mapping and planning infrastructure. So again, we're going to be hitting this from a bunch of different angles today. So I hope this leads to a good chunk of new insights. I expect some for myself, and I've been in the broadband mapping game for 7.5 years now. So just drumming up a little pressure for everybody on the panel, but I think it'll be a good time. So Zach, do you have, as co-moderator, and I guess this is the first time I've introduced it, so sorry for dragging my feet. Do you want me to add, or do you want to add anything else to that before I go into the PSC talk?
I would just add, Coulter and I hatched this idea a few months back to bring the broadband topic as a panel discussion to WLIA. It's something that, as a group we've talked about. It's been a legislative priority for WLIA. It's been something that a number of our members have had to be involved with locally, but just to bring it forward, as I think a lot of people in WLIA in our group hear broadband and it's hard to make the connection sometimes to how how data being produced at the local level is being used and how critical it is, and what is broadband mapping, and ultimately how do we get higher speed services out to our communities, especially our rural communities. So hopefully, I think the intent of this panel is to kind of bring it home to all of us by looking at these different perspectives, and hopefully get a good discussion going on the topic going forward.
Absolutely, and thank you, Zach. And I'll say, coming from another slight leaning of bias as this year's chair on the technical committee, I certainly see broadband as an opportunity to put a little more muscle behind. I've got a couple of layers in mind, and I imagine I'll refer to them as we get into the talk. But basically being able to use broadband as an added forum to push for better data in our work, which of course is helpful in the broadband issue, but has the flexibility to support other parts of our GIS world here in Wisconsin as well. So I'm going to go ahead and move into the PSC talk. Again, assuming I can click forward on my screen. There we go. So full disclosure, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is getting ripped out of the recently recorded PSC presentation for the upcoming Esri virtual conference. And they told us to come up with a catchy name. So I channeled my inner high school self. I was in high school in the early aughts, and I remembered a very corny Culver's commercial that went along the lines of a better brand of beef makes a butter burger better. So to try to come up with something uniquely Wisconsin, I sent a better grain of data makes a broadband map better to Esri. They accepted it, so I trust it's okay. And I don't think I need to explain butter burgers and Culver's to very many people here. But the big thing I do want to point at, and this does lean a lot at what the Wisconsin Broadband Office, the little office that I'm part of at the Public Service Commission, does, as we've gotten more and more invested over the last few years in working with providers to gather and depict broadband coverage data. And of course, as people are getting increasingly concerned about mapping internet coverage data at the census block level, which I'll only gloss over those problems briefly, in part because they've been said multiple times in the past, including at WLIA. The finer grain data that we can get, the better we can do analysis, and the better we can understand where coverage really is and isn't, and help advise planning for a more holistic approach in improving the internet access, affordability, and adoption situations here in Wisconsin. In this screen cap on the right, the map, not the Culver's sign, you can actually see, I don't know if you can see my mouse, feel free to comment in the chat if you can see my cursor, it helped me a little bit, but you can see the road centerline buffers coming from one of our providers in the state who did submit some of their coverage data at a pretty granular level relative to a lot of the neighboring territory. This is in Chippewa County, Wisconsin, based on the label, where a lot of this is at the census block level, and I have feedback that folks can see the cursor, so that is good. But ultimately, we're going for more of a granular approach like this. We will ultimately see that on the federal level as well, and we'll go into that more as we move on to slides. And Adam Derringer, I think that flavor of the day when I took that photo was really Reese's. I don't remember much about it besides peanut butter and chocolate though. So programs and resources relying on broadband data. Certainly the biggest thing that my state agency, the Public Service Commission, which for those of you not familiar, it's typically a small state agency that regulates our utilities here in Wisconsin. Think electric, natural gas, water, etc. But we do have a small, roughly 7 or 8 person office whose focus is on expanding broadband statewide, which is where I work, and my mapping partner Milena, who is not able to join us today, works as well. The thing that our office is most known for is the Broadband Expansion Grant Program, which over the course of the last 8 years, we've rolled out about $72 million worth of funding for 268 grant projects hitting almost every county in the state. And while I can't go into the finer details of this now, we are actually, and this is what most of my fellow staffers are doing right now, we're getting ready to roll out a $100 million grant round that officially starts, I believe, a week from today. And we had the governor's office released a press release on it a week ago today. So things are moving very quickly at our office. We offer a number of mapping products, both online with the Wisconsin Broadband Map and through print tools as well. And a lot of the work that we do, everything highlighted on this slide, is driven by mapping data that we gather from either the Federal Communications Commission or from ISPs themselves. So ultimately, in order for us to make smart decisions, you can understand having accurate and complete broadband coverage mapping layers in particular is essential to our work. More recently, starting in the latter part of 2020 and picking up in intensity over these first few months of 2021, we've been diving into a project called the Governor's Task Force on Broadband Access. This has brought roughly 30 folks together from the governmental side, the internet service provider side, and stakeholders from elsewhere within kind of the broadband industry to come together to craft ideas about how to expedite the process of making broadband internet accessible, affordable, and more easily adopted across all of Wisconsin. And we broke our work into several working groups. The one that I, Milena, and Andy Faust were directly involved in, along with the CEO at Norvato, which is where Garen works, was focused on data and mapping. And while we're not going to go through all the details of it today, because that would take much too long, the mapping recommendation list became 40 items long. You could tell there are a bunch of detail-driven GIS people in the room, because some of those recommendations do get you close to the weeds of the broadband mapping issue. But the big things that, if you want to look at like some umbrella or catch-all recommendations that really tie to mapping, these bullets really summarize them well. It's of course important for us to gather access, coverage, speed, and quality validation, affordability and adoption data at a granular level, while of course managing the confidentiality of working with individual citizens and residents, certainly with the proprietary information coming from the provider community and others as well. It definitely is a balance that we're all, I think, trying to figure out better at this point. Thinking about this from the perspective of getting to where we want to go, getting everyone connected, we need to identify areas with the greatest need for improved connectivity. We need to also keep track of factors like permitting and other roadblocks that affect how quickly the internet can be rolled out, especially in areas where, you know, things are lacking still, or the options that do exist are kind of slow. And we also, especially with kind of all the big data collection ideas that we talked about within our mapping and data subcommittee, we also really need to remind ourselves and other stakeholders that we need to also lean on the work that other folks like the FCC are already doing in order to make this data collection and data analysis an easier lift. And I mean, admittedly, a less expensive lift, because you could expand this into a pretty big, overwhelming task. And I mean, just reflecting on work in the broadband office in the past year, I, speaking very personally, I'm impressed that we've gotten the work done that we have, but the demand to generate more output from our offices is a little overwhelming at times. So to the extent that we can be efficient in our efforts, that's important as well. So I do want to highlight probably one of the longer existing initiatives that have allowed us to dig further into the broadband mapping and data collection issue over these last couple of years, and highlight some of the successes from that. We've been running a voluntary broadband coverage data collection since the fall of 2018. We identified this as a good process or a good project to follow up on, because especially at the time, and we're still seeing this now, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, usually takes about 9 to 12 months to process data that they collect before they put that data on their national broadband map. And if we're able to work directly with the internet service provider community, which we are through this project, we're usually able to get this coverage data up on our map a few months faster than what the feds are able to do. Although admittedly, and in a good way, just because of the demand that's been on our office lately, that time gap between us and the feds has gotten closer. So efficiency, again, like, is an important key for us. But probably the bigger thing that's becoming exciting about this project now for us is that direct interaction that we're able to have with the providers across the state. And it allows, I mean, more of a relationship to be built, leading to, I cite holistic broadband action here on the slide. But if you look at the bar chart on the right, we went from having about 20 internet providers giving us coverage data at the time to having the high majority of our internet service providers here in Wisconsin giving the PSC data directly in order to get on the broadband map sooner. And as I move on to the next slide, we're starting to get entirely spatial broadband coverage submissions from a few of our providers. And there's another chunk of the provider community who's given us data both at the census block level, but with effectively a cookie cutter boundary that we're able to apply to the census blocks that they gave us coverage data for, to really just make their coverage a little more refined and a little more accurate on the broadband map. And one thing that we've been working on as an office, both within the governor's task force and within more one-on-one conversations with the provider community, is to just really get a survey, if you will, of what the capabilities of mapping are at the individual internet service provider level, with the idea that, one, the FCC is going to be making a granular broadband coverage mapping requirement here in the next couple of years. So we may as well all get ready for that. Two, working with providers at this stage and trying to get some of that granular data as the providers are willing to do that allows us to have, at least a slightly more accurate broadband map more quickly, rather than just waiting for the feds to get their solution completely on ice. So this data collection process, one, it helps with speed. Two, I think it gives us at the state and the provider community the opportunity to get an understanding of what's coming when the feds make this mandatory. Ultimately the goal is to make a better Wisconsin broadband map, and I certainly think it helps for that. But we certainly still have a ways to go with that. So watching my time, I've only got a couple more minutes here. I just want to highlight the big priority hurdles, challenges, whatever we want to call it here, coming up for our office. Certainly, we're going to be continuing to work with broadband mapping coverage needs. The FCC standards are going to evolve, and we want to work with those. The big thing with mapping coverage in any of the other subject areas I'm going to highlight very quickly is that we intend to go out and see what federal partners and local partners are already doing. We will identify basically where we see holes in those data collection processes and basically try to fill in gaps wherever that is necessary. And to the extent that we can serve as a clearinghouse for folks for some of their broadband planning work, I think the PSC intends to do that as well. Prioritizing access needs, there's the concept of the broadband coverage fabric, which basically filters out, you need internet at this house, but you don't need internet in the rest, or fixed internet, wireline internet, if you will, in the other parts of that particular parcel. You don't need fiber connections to the chicken coop. Building up a fabric concept to really weigh out where needs are and aren't is going to be an important priority for us as well. Andy's going to go into that a little bit with his talk. We also, that we haven't gone as far down the foxhole of this yet, again, validating coverage and speeds, partnering with folks like the folks behind the National Broadband Availability Map, the NTIA, also our State Department of Public Instruction, DPI. Shelley Whitty, as you all know, have done some work with speed testing as well. So I anticipate those partnerships are going to continue. And certainly looking at equity and really where the advantages and disadvantages are for folks when it comes to getting and accessing and being able to afford to use internet. Getting an understanding of that's going to be important. And that spills into affordability and adoption as well, kind of a relatively recent topic for the broadband office to start digging into, but I believe we'll be getting more into that as certainly this year and beyond we all move forward here. So I've already touched on most of these mapping next steps in one way or another. Certain keys that I really want to highlight is the fact that I anticipate we'll continue reaching out with the provider community to support more granular data submissions. I do, especially with the idea of the broadband mapping fabric. You all know, especially folks in the local and county government mapping world, know that you author a lot of authoritative data, that as we can bring that data more and more into a cohesive state project or state layer, think of course the broadband, or not broadband, the parcel layer, but certainly addressing and road center lines for Next Gen 911. In my eyes, building footprints and public lands are also vital layers to build up more of a collaboration across state and local governments and county governments to bring foundational layers more into greater availability for, in my specific case, broadband mapping. That's going to be important as well. And the last bullet I've got there, to the extent that the PSC can support data collections for various parts of this broadband mapping question, I anticipate will play a role there as well. So I believe, and for whenever we share the slides out, I did provide a few links to the maps and data that we have available at the PSC. And then otherwise, if you have questions, feel free, of course, to reach out to me, or we can discuss after the slideshow. And Milena Bernardinello, who is our GIS and broadband data analyst, certainly can be available for this stuff as well. So without further ado, I'm going to just move on into Garen's talk on using GIS data for work from the internet service provider's side.
Awesome. Thanks, Coulter. Hope you can hear me all right.
Yep.
Great. So Coulter provided a lot of data there, and some of that I'll touch on a little bit, kind of give you an overview of what we as a provider utilize. First, I want to say thank you for inviting me to the panel. I hope we'll have some decent discussion. At the end, you can certainly stump me with a lot of the questions you'll have, but I'll provide whatever I can to kind of illustrate how much we depend on the work that you are all doing. So I can't guarantee I'll go through 10 minutes. I can BS normally pretty good, but I'll kind of follow the script a little bit and kind of just go through the slides here. And again, at the end, we'll any questions for me or the panel will be great. I'm the engineering construction manager at Norvado. I joined the team here in 2019. Prior to that, we were using some mapping software, but not really in the GIS world. It's more proprietary, kind of our own. It was purchased software, but it wasn't really tied to what we wanted. And in 2020, spring of 2020, we purchased Enterprise from Esri and have been slowly catching up and getting into utilizing data much more efficiently. So I just want to touch base on, and we're a few slides too far, maybe, Coulter, but just on kind of who we are, and I can talk on that. You can leave the better graphics up if you like. So we are a broadband provider in Wisconsin's northwest region of the state. We kind of cover and are in 5 different counties, as you can see: Douglas, Bayfield, Sawyer, Ashland, Price. And we are what we would consider an ILEC and CLEC provider. ILEC being an incumbent provider, which traditionally means that's an area we are obligated to serve as kind of our original territory. CLEC is competitive. It would mean something in the lines of, just for comparative purposes, Norvado choosing to say build into Superior, which is a CenturyLink territory, we would be considered a CLEC there. And some of you where you live are probably very familiar with that. You have someone new coming in and providing broadband or services, and they would be maybe considered a CLEC. We are split in 2 regions. In 2019, Norvado purchased Price County Telephone, obviously in Price County, centered in Phillips, and Norvado is centered in Cable, Wisconsin. And we purchased them and have begun expediting their fiber to the home rollout. They had kind of picked some areas and built fiber to the home. And as we've made that purchase and gone through it, we've again accelerated is probably a better term. So our west region, what we consider the normal or the original Norvado, which was Chequamegontel, and it's been rebranded as Norvado, is now 100% fiber to the home. I kind of debated on putting that as 99.9% because we do have not every single drop is in place to locations, but we provide all of our services via fiber there. Our east region rollout, or the finalization in Price County, we plan to have completed by 2023, barring any material delays or major setbacks. So for the most part, with regards to GIS, and we'll kind of go through this a little bit, we are a consumer of a lot of the data that other teams, such as yourselves, counties, whatnot, put out there. One of the major things that we do consume is parcel data, and that's why from us, very selfishly, we look for the next update, and we utilize that data for a multitude of things. We look at some of the zoning. We try to determine if something's residential or commercial, and we've used the parcel data to upgrade, I'll say upgrade or update our own information to create what we call the TAM, or total addressable market. I've heard that term before, but basically what we're working toward is any consumer within our region should be able to type in their address, and we should be very quickly able to tell them, yes, you are a customer, and here's your options. Things you've seen with some other companies for sure, but we're really just kind of catching up and getting into this, and very excited about that part of it. The parcel data, again, is critical to us because when we do make those applications into the PSC for grants, one of the first questions they ask us is how many locations you're passing. And obviously, with some of the short timelines, as Coulter mentioned, we're going to be going into the next round here in a week. We kind of have to have a bunch of ideas on where we want to go, and in order to get a good quick idea of that, we use the parcel data to check and see if there's improvements in that parcel that may would be something we'd want to report. Let's say in just a general area, there's 300 parcels, and we show 250 with improvements, and we would glean the information of zoning that 220 of those are residential. So that's what we would report on a quick side into our grant applications. So getting that parcel data, again, very important for us. Tied to the parcels, which we do use, is the physical address. So when that's there, awesome. And we've also pulled and utilized mailing address, because we do have customers who live in our territory that may not have provided a excellent address sometimes. And if we can find that mailing address, I'm assuming they get their tax bill, and so we can reach out to them via that if they're a potential. So that helps out quite a little bit. We've gone through now and entered all the addresses within our ILEC territory into our mapping and billing software to hold, if you will. And so that's really come along. We're kind of excited about that. It's a long process, and I know for some it may seem pretty simple, and we kind of felt it would be something simple, but we spent a considerable amount of time just trying to clean up what we had, and that's probably the biggest challenge for us, is going through our old records and changing to the new parcel information, such as how something simple like county highway is written out, because if we aren't following that format, we start creating dual entries, and it gets a little ugly. So for those of you that are very day-to-day into that, I appreciate it. I really do. I will say thank you all day long, because it's very valuable information for us. So one of the things that we when we do provide data, we kind of flip the hat a little bit, and I'll speak a little bit to kind of where Norvado is a supplier of information is to some things that Coulter touched on a little bit, and that's into the FCC and the PSC for this data. So when we do apply for, and you can go forward a few slides there, Coulter, to that. So we are required to provide 477 data twice a year. We've really just kind of recently started that again in 2019 was the first round that I experienced here at Novato, and that information is a report of our broadband speeds. It's tied to census blocks. It's good information. It's not as granular as we'd all like it to get to, and that's a little bit of a challenge. What we've experienced in the past, and what has kind of been interesting, and when we supply this information, if we say that we provide 50 meg download by 10 meg upload in a census block to one customer, that entire census block will be reported as us as a provider at 50 by 10, even though we may only be touching a handful of people within that census block. So What we have kind of referenced that is sometimes that's good, sometimes it's kind of a poison pill, because when new initiatives or programs are put out there, if we've or someone else has reported that speed, it may eliminate that census block. And for any of you that live in a rural area where a provider is not providing sufficient speeds, and you're kind of wondering why someone isn't in there, sometimes that may be a reason for that. That area may just be claimed as a certain speed, and it makes it difficult for the next provider to kind of take part in some of the grants and programs that are meant to improve that. So so that, and they do allow for that. You can a little bit anyways. They'll kind of say, they understand that we don't provide it to everyone, but again, once it's reported in there, it follows through the census block, reporting it to the FCC. We also provide hub data. This is again another relatively new. I don't know every single in and out of that. It's kind of a more granular, and it's built to track build-out applications if you're receiving CAF support, or other. There are other few triggers that require a company such as Nervado to report into Hub, and this one is when I say granular, it's a little bit more exciting because they do require that we report the Latin launch for a building footprint within a 10-meter range. And I'll freely admit that that's where we do go to some of the county's data, and we look to see if you've got a address point and or those building footprints, which are tremendous, and then we can more quickly tie ourselves to where we are there and get that information submitted correctly, because obviously we'd like to not make the FCC upset with us when it comes to having incorrect data. They do allow us to make some adjustments, but they kind of expect you to have it right the first time. So again, when we can borrow data that's been put out there by the counties, it's tremendous. It's a tremendous help to us. So again, we first step through any county GIS information to define that, and if it really comes down to where we can't find something, we will go on site and do that. All of this mapping takes a tremendous amount of time, which you're all aware of, and us being a relatively small staff to try to get out to the and I could be quoted wrong on this, but of the to spread this data on the 11,000 parcels that we touch within just Bayfield County, and make sure that we're doing that ourselves, obviously in the time frames is pretty prohibitive. I just don't have that many people running around. So again, we are very, very happy to see that information out there and be able to utilize it. So considering grants, and just kind of touch on that if you want to go forward a little bit here, Colder, thanks. So Nervado provides high-speed broadband users in the ILEC and the CLEC territory. Kind of touched on what the difference is on the ILEC and CLEC. We utilized, again, Esri ArcGIS Pro. We purchased full enterprise from them, and so we've set our contractors up as a certain amount of users, my staff, and we're using that software to track our own projects, updates. I think we're one of the few providers that I'm aware of that have gone that far within it. A lot of people are using, just a portion of it per se. It doesn't mean we're the experts on it. We kind of just jumped in with both feet and said we're doing this, and I've got a tremendously awesome GIS specialist on my team, Scott Johnson, that has really furthered us in this and kind of made this something that fits us as providers. They have some really neat tools, but then just the questions we ask and how do we track this, how do we add this, what can we do with this data? He's really pushed that. So we do the assessment of our PSC grants quickly, kind of touch on that a little bit, within those address points and within those areas, and we try to find the potential locations to provide the information for the grant applications. And then again, we use this data to the zoning information within that to help us provide the correct data. Last year, and I'll use another term, and that was a major initiative, and that was the RDOC program, nationwide FCC program, and Rural Development Opportunity Fund. If I've got every one of those words wrong, you can correct me in the chat, but I believe that's what it stood for. And we as a company, utilizing GIS and information that you have all been contributing to, we assessed a little over, I will say, a little over $100 million worth of build, right? So I mean, we grabbed a tremendous chunk of Wisconsin and looked at it, and the traditional method of us as a company doing that, with what we call an area coverage survey, or just trying to count rooftops and applying stuff, we would have never done that. So I mean, the ability to jump into something relatively quickly, assess those rooftops, layout designs into it, and then be able to basically create a strategy for programs such as that is tremendous. So very, very neat tool. So we're very excited to be utilizing this and be a part of it. And I'll touch a little bit now on just some of the benefits that we do see for you all. I mean, I think Coulter hit it really, really well. You're literally conducting this entire virtual conference virtually, and that's done via broadband provided by somebody such as us, or your provider. Without that, this is not happening, right? So we touch on some things that we try to pass on to our customers and whatnot, and you can go forward a little bit, Coulter. So we feel, and I think most of you would agree, broadband is essential for distance learning. If you're in an area of Wisconsin, which hopefully we're getting less and less with the goal, that is still sitting there with a kind of a not awesome high-speed broadband, I think you are painfully aware of how critical it becomes when a pandemic and a reaction to it is to have students distance learn. You have to be home, and if you've got one or two students and yourself and a spouse or what have you, and they're all trying to do things, and access, it's difficult. You need that broadband, and you need the bandwidth to do it. So we feel it is essential for distance learning. We have done some assessments on this. I'll throw out a percentage. I briefly talked to Coulter about adding this. We feel that, from what we've talked to some realtors and seen some other information, having fiber to your household is I've heard numbers range from 3 to 5% in just a simple property in value, or increase in value. So that's pretty impressive to say, simply having fiber is driving people to purchase that cabin or relocate to that area. Once you do have high-speed broadband, you're sitting in Norado West territory, we call it Norado West, up by the cable area. Work from home for you, if your company allows it, it's a reality. I mean, you can do that. We can offer up to gig speeds. We're slowly increasing our own standard speeds upward to more symmetrical. 300 by 300 is in our near future, just as that's what our offering is on fiber. So work from home becomes a reality. One of the things that I really do like about what we kind of do and offer up and allow, if you or assist with, I guess, is we kind of take that rural area and we put it on a level playing field, or perhaps better if you're sitting in a metro area. Maybe you're you don't have the fiber. I mean, you have decent speeds, but you're not on the fiber, you're not on the gig, if you will. So I mean, we've gotten some cabins in our area, some very rural homes, some rural farms that have fiber to them. I mean, they could get gig by gig if they chose, which I think is pretty amazing. And what that also helps, if you are sitting in more of a urban area, and you allow the work from home, it opens the door for some rural people that may not have to relocate. I mean, maybe they can stay in an area and help your company or your area, or give you the option of helping somebody if you're out there and and you have the high-speed broadband. So what we kind of feel with this and kind of the summary is, and what we're seeing is high-speed broadband is I will say it's approaching a level of necessity to conduct. I mean, we all agree, hey, you buy that house, or you're already building a house. I mean, power is a no-brainer. It's becoming a little bit more interesting, some of the solar options and alternatives, but we're getting there where people are in areas are realizing, that high speed and certainly, I mean, that's, it's being recognized by the PSC, the FCC with the programs they're pushing out there, but high speed is approaching that level where it's becoming a necessity for the home. And we're excited about that. And that's where Nevada really, has tried to step up and make sure that we are providing that to our customers, because really, we provide that and it really opens the door for them to do so much more. So I believe that kind of wraps up my presentation. I didn't put a timer on myself, Colter, so I hope I hit the marks where I needed to be. If you do have any questions on the PowerPoint, you can reach out to me. The address there is for our marketing guy. He can talk a lot better fluff than I can. But from the engineering and GIS perspective, I hope you found this a little bit beneficial to see from a provider side.
Awesome. And you did great, Garen, especially since we got this together pretty quickly over the last few weeks. And I especially haven't always been around to support some of this, just because I was away the last week and change. So I think you did great. And I think we're ready to move right into Andy Faust's presentation on this lovely subject. Andy, are you out there?
I'm here. So hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yup.
All right, Garen, unmute that mic. I got some questions for you. I'm going to throw his presentation off the rails here. So if there's one statewide layer that you'd want as a provider, what would that be?
I think where we're sitting is, I really like the parcel data, having those parcels like granular, having information behind it, having something I can grab. And then in addition to that is the, or maybe separate too, but very close is the building footprints. As that becomes more critical for some of the FCC, it really helps us assess where things are. We get a lot of calls from people. I'm out at the spot. If we can find the parcel, great. If that's updated faster than it currently is, and it's done pretty well, but if it could be updated, even faster. We get a lot of new builds where they split the 40, they've got X, going on, and tie that really helps us kind of determine, how do we get there? What's our cost? What's the obligation of the customer? Things of that nature. So it's data that's being put together that we really try to utilize as much as possible.
All right, next question for you. So obviously you guys cover a pretty rural area, Douglas, Bayfield, Sawyer, Ashland, Price counties. You guys are building out 100% fiber to home network. When other providers say it's not worth the effort, it's not worth the return on investment, and they're not doing it. So why are you guys doing it and the other one's not doing it?
Well, I could go, I guess, more philosophical, or I could go kind of more us. So I'm sure most of the people in this group have heard in everyday life, why would I need a fixed provider, a fixed, a fiber to me? Aren't we going to be replaced by cell phones or fixed wireless or satellite or what have you? I think that from our perspective is the data demands are constantly increasing, and we don't know that wireless and or satellite will keep up with those demands. Tremendous leaps have been made in them, and they're really neat. For a long time, we felt probably that they were more direct competitor, and I think now we're realizing that when we're a provider and you have fiber to that home or business, and the bandwidth that's achievable on fiber is virtually unlimited with the right equipment. We're really looking at saying, if we invest in this, we can kind of, number one, we keep ourselves relevant, because now we are a provider that's staying in front of you, and if you can get this bandwidth from us, that's tremendous. And number two, I don't know too many businesses, and again, I'm speaking totally just my thoughts. I don't know that a lot of businesses that are willing to put all of their business dealings, uploads, everything into a satellite and or a wireless provider. I'm sure there's some. I don't mean to speak ill of it. I just don't know that there are a lot doing that. I think there's a reliability that comes with having that fiber to you, having those speeds available, that really helps them stay relevant in the areas that we are. As you said, we're very rural compared to a lot of areas. So having a fiber to them it's an investment.
I have more questions, but I'll just hold them to the end because I'll blow through my slides and make sure the other presenters get a chance to talk. I'd rather ask you questions though.
Well, you're realizing that I talk too much. That's what you're saying is
Well,
we gotta
I
make the answer shorter.
Yeah, I don't talk too much. That's the problem. You go to the next slide, Coulter. So Coulter asked me to talk about a couple things, how to use existing data that we currently have to kind of maybe map where broadband maybe need it. And Garen talked a little bit about how Nevada is doing some of this stuff, and how to leverage the existing statewide layers, like the parcels and the addressing stuff for 911 and things like that we're doing. Go to the next slide. So this is an example that I put together that we've done for a different project, but I think it's pertinent to kind of look at, an area of interest or something that's there. We tried to highlight, high return areas for, possible broadband grants or things like that. And we kind of do the same thing that Nevada was doing. We're looking at all the parcels with improvement value over a certain amount, building centroids off of there, and then kind of gathering other large, maybe gathering type areas where campgrounds or sports venues, group quarters, apartments, things like that. We've also used business locations, and we do that based off of similar to what they have done with either zoning or existing land use. We've also used databases from chambers and local county economic development corporations, and we've also purchased some of that business data from commercial providers that actually wasn't too bad, and it kind of gave us a number of employees and things that was kind of helpful. Next slide, Coulter. So again, this is a map we create for all hazard mitigation plans at the county level, but it kind of does what we said, and it would be what you expect in a rural county, kind of where the parcel density improvement values would be. It's no surprise around the lakes and the city of Anago and city of Village of White Lake, and it kind of shows you there is. But even the little red dots that pepper through those are all the centroids of the parcel improvements. You kind of see where you probably get your most bang for your buck. And I'm sure most of the providers are analyzing stuff like this when they're looking at rolling out projects, but I think it'd be something that may be helpful for, local broadband planning or grants. Next slide. So this is my last slide. Like I said, I'll go real quick here. Again, I think we can continue to leverage the data like the existing parcel data, like the example I gave, but we're currently working on a statewide addressing data set, and that would be coming in, a uniformed data set similar to the parcels. I think the providers would be very interested in that. And we're also in the discussion of how we'd move that to the building point or the building centroids for areas around the state, because as you're aware, in some of our rural areas, some of those buildings are 1 or maybe even 2 miles off the road. Another layer that we're working on for the next gen 911 is the road center lines. And, maybe that's something we need to look at. Do we need to really make sure we're, cataloging those road center lines, and maybe the right of ways, distance, who owns those roads? Are they private, county, when they're looking at infrastructure like running fiber and things like that, and how those things would benefit the providers or benefiting a rollout of a huge network like Nevada has. And I think that's it. And I'll pass it on to Nick to talk about tribal stuff.
Awesome. Thanks, Andy. If Coulter, I need you to move to the next slide. I'll give you a kind of a little wink there when you can slide over the next slide. And if one of the moderators can pin me to the front screen here so we can see me, that'd be great. Although nobody really wants to look at me, I understand that. But yeah, there you go.
We'll see how good my eyes are at catching winks.
All right, sounds good. I'll try and exaggerate it. So yeah, basically, hi everybody, thanks for coming out today. I'm Nick Anderson. I'm the UAS program administrator with the Ho-Chunk Nation in Black River Falls, Wisconsin, and I'm one of the members of our broadband team here at the nation. And we've had a very unique set of circumstances that we've kind of had to deal with throughout this whole broadband process that for us has started well over a year ago, even before COVID was a thing. We started looking into broadband and trying to deploy it to our different areas around the state of Wisconsin. So I'll get right into it. The funding. Funding is a big part of broadband. You gotta have the money to give to these ISPs to put into the ground. They're not going to do it for free. And cash, as always, is king. If you have cash on hand, you're able to give that to the ISPs to deploy your projects. Not only is that going to be the best case scenario, but it's also going to be the best case scenario to get it done in the shortest amount of time. But for most of us, we're looking at grants, and there's a lot of federal and state grants that are out and available for us. Through ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, I believe it is, there's over, close to $220 billion with a B, $220 billion in infrastructure that's coming out. And granted, not all of that is for broadband, but a large chunk of that is going to be for broadband per this administration's kind of priorities. So there's a lot of funding coming down from ARPA. And then there's this thing called EBB, Emergency Broadband Benefit. And that's not so much for infrastructure deployment, but basically if you are a qualifying member, if there's one person in your household that's a qualifying member, you can receive up to $50 a month off for your internet or broadband service. And if you're a tribal member, you live on tribal land, it can be $75 off. And many of those people also be qualified for a one-time benefit of $100 to purchase like a tablet or a laptop or a cell phone, something that kind of gives them that broadband service capability to be able to consume that information. And then there's the NTIA. Coulter touched a little bit about NTIA previously, but the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, they have all sorts of different grants coming out that all have different levels of funding for different purposes. I know there's a tribal broadband connectivity grant that's $1 billion that they're going to be giving the tribes throughout the United States so they can build out their fiber networks. And there's also $300 million given to just regular state and local kind of partnerships and projects for deployment of broadband. And there's state funding, kind of like how Coulter said before, the PSC's been giving out state broadband planning and construction grants for quite some time now. And the state itself is also receiving federal money that Governor Evers and the legislature are now putting towards the PSC's kind of grant funding program. So they themselves are receiving some of this federal ARPA money and whatnot. So the overall theme in here is there's a lot of funding available. Now, how do you use it? What do you use? Where do you use it? Is a big question. Then there's another one, RDOF, and Garen, I think we both got this wrong, actually. I didn't realize it until I just looked at my screen. I put rural development, it's actually rural digital. Okay, so rural digital opportunity fund, but really development, that kind of works too. We're talking about developing out in these rural areas. So rural digital opportunity fund, and that is kind of a very unique type of funding. And Coulter, you can switch to the next slide, but you'll see this map here in the next slide, and that is the RDOF areas in the state of Wisconsin. So basically RDOF, for people who don't know, was essentially a reverse auction. So these ISPs went out and said, hey, we're going to put kind of the lowest bid to get broadband connectivity out to these different areas. We're going to, if whoever came at the lowest bid, I think it was the FCC, I think it was the FCC kind of went, so okay, ISP A, let's say LTD broadband, you can have funding for this area that you kind of bidded it at. And it doesn't take up the full cost of the project, but it's just something to kind of help along. So in the state of Wisconsin, LTD broadband and then CCO holdings, are better known as Charter Communications. Those are the two largest winners in the state of Wisconsin. They are actually the two largest winners in the whole United States. The third largest winner in the state of Wisconsin was a company called Reedsburg Utility Commission, which is just northwest of Madison. You can see that little green area down there in the map. But I'm sorry, not LTD. RDOF is kind of really unique. So RDOF, there's 6 years that funding has to be utilized. And so 6 years that funding has to be utilized to do these build outs. And it can be really complicated on because none of these areas asked for this funding to be auctioned off at. So like, for instance, us as the Ho-Chunk Nation, we didn't ask for some of our properties to be given to Charter, to be given to LDT. But once that funding is kind of given to some of these areas, it could complicate going for other funding. So as an example, we went out and tried to get a PSC grant this last application round, and we were denied. And part of the reason we were denied is because we were told that I think for that area was Charter. Charter already had an RDOF auction area over our properties. So there was already federal funding that was going to one of our properties to get broadband deployed in that area. And we were going for state funding, and they didn't want to duplicate the funds. And we were kind of amazed by that, because here we are, we're trying to get a little bit more of the funding kind of covered going through the PSC. And basically they were saying that, you know, RDOF's kind of, they would want to duplicate funds, which I understand. That all kind of makes sense. You can get going to the next slide here, Coulter. So funding considerations, we've all heard of this project triangle before, right? Cost, quality, and timing. Well, cost for most of us is not going to be a problem when we're deploying these projects out there, because that cost is going to be all tied up into the grants and other types of funding that you're going to be able to get. The quality, kind of the same thing. You know, even for this funding to be fully given out to these different areas, it has to reach a certain minimum broadband status, and the usual minimum that we've been working with for the last so many years has been 25 up and 3 downloads. So 25 megabits upload, 3 megabits, 25 download, 3 megabits upload. But recently through the state and the feds, they've changed that to now 120. So 100 down, 20 up. But a lot of companies are offering even better services than that, and more is always better when it comes to that kind of quality stuff. But timing is going to be the big consideration or complexity when it comes to getting a lot of this funding across, and how you plan for that timing. So like I said before, RDOF, it has to be used within 6 years. Well, what area wants to wait 6 years to get broadband deployed in the area? People want broadband on their properties in their communities now or yesterday. PSC is around 2 years. That's a little better. And if you have any additional barriers to entry, that can really complicate the process as far as the timing goes. So if you can go to the next slide, Coulter. Now I'll get into more of the tribal complexities that we've kind of been seeing for a long time here at the Ho-Chunk Nation. So this photo that you see right here is a screenshot from our GIS coordinator, Wyatt Paytash at the Ho-Chunk Nation, created a broadband connectivity or broadband application management application for internal uses within the Ho-Chunk Nation. This community that we're looking at right now is in Black River Falls. You can see several different parcel types here, and there's a legend at the lower left of this slide. And so there's different types of parcel statuses that the Ho-Chunk Nation has. And this is just kind of a brief, small overview. So in the red, we have fee simple taxed property like you or I would own. And then we have the yellow properties, and those yellow properties are trust properties held in federal trust for individual allottees of the tribe. So each one of these gold or yellow properties could be owned by one tribal member, or they could be owned by 20, or they can be owned by 50 tribal members, or 200 even. So, and then according, I believe it's 25 CFR 25 part 169 within the Code of Federal Regulations kind of administers how we give right-of-ways on tribally owned trust land. So for each one of these tribal trust properties, we have to go out and get a separate right-of-way application from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And I'll go back to finish those parcels. The blue and the orange are 100% owned by the nation themselves, the nation as an entity themselves. So the nation can authorize a right-of-way agreement on their properties. However, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the BIA, is still the entity giving out these right-of-way applications, or signing off on these right-of-way applications to these ISPs. And this process can take 9 months to a year and more. So imagine trying to get funding that you have to use, let's say in 2 years or less, and you have this right-of-way application that you have to get for several properties, a separate application for each property. And this could take upwards of a year, and sometimes they take even more. And to further complicate things, these allotments, you have to get at least 50% consent from the tribal members on that allotment. So we have to send certified mailings out to 400 people and receive 50% of them back saying, yes, we will authorize, let's say, Novato. We will authorize Novato to have a right of way to put down broadband infrastructure on our property. Some of our properties have right-of-way agreements already written into the road that was constructed, but a lot of our federal trust properties do not have that. You have to get specific permission every single time you put a new line in. To throw another layer of complexity into it, on the east side of this photo, you can see kind of a large, lightly red shaded area. That shaded red area is an RDOF auctioned off area for this community. And this auction, I believe, was won by LDT. So, and you can see exactly where Coulter just kind of pointed out with the mouse. So you can see there's a little square there. Well, there's not even, we used to have trailers there. There's not even trailers there anymore. So when we first looked at this, we were wondering, how did this red area come out of nowhere? We've never drawn a box like that ever. I'm fairly positive that's not its own census block, because there's 0 people that live there now. But it's really interesting how some of these RDOF areas were kind of auctioned off, and how these ISPs kind of chose, I don't know what they chose, but how they got these boundaries on there. But it complicates this project as well. If you can see kind of on the roads through this photo, there's a yellow dotted line, and that's the line that we kind of projected to where we're going to put in new broadband. So that one broadband line will go through fee simple property to allotment property to Ho-Chunk Nation Trust, back into allotment property, back into Ho-Chunk Nation Trust. Each one of those separate properties it goes through is a different right-of-way application, and we only have RDOF funding for the eastern half of it, not for the western half. Well, let's say we don't want LDT. Let's say we want charter. So we can get a PSC application or NTIA or an ARPA application to get funding for the western property that's in orange. But would we get denied that same funding for charter if we wanted to put in the eastern side of our property, because they're going to say, sorry, LTD, which is primarily a wireless broadband company, already won an auction on that area. So there's a lot of different complexities here kind of all at play. And one of the biggest things that you have to kind of consider when doing this from the child perspective is a lot of thought, a lot of thinking. So a lot of planning is really important. And we'll go to the next slide to kind of talk a little bit more about planning as we kind of wrap up my part of the presentation. Planning is going to be one of the most important things to consider when you're deploying these broadband projects in your community. Funding is obviously a huge thing. And so for the rest of you guys that are all state and local government, take advantage of the partnerships that are available to you in your areas. So there are tribes in different counties and different areas that are getting tribal specific broadband dollars that you guys can, I don't want to say take advantage of, that sounds bad, but you guys can kind of tap into and access and work with that tribe in that county or in your area to partner and make a bigger project. And a lot of these applications, the PSC applications, any other federal applications, they want to see increased partnerships. They want to see these public-private partnerships where you work with other private entities as well. So get a conglomerate of partners together in your area and utilize all the different funding sources available to you, and to get the best bang for your buck when you're deploying fiber in your area. Location, like I said, look at the different areas that might have RDOF already assigned to it. And I'm not saying that you'll never get funding in an RDOF area. I'm just telling you that that's what happened to us, and we hope that that doesn't happen in the future. But there's a lot of planning that goes into the applications of these grants too, and just the management of it too. So if you need assistance, talk to a consultant. These guys are used to doing it all the time, and this is a lot of work, for the Ho-Chunk Nation specifically. We have a very checkerboard pattern of properties. We have properties, I think it's 27 counties in the state of Wisconsin. And so think about all the different ISPs that we have to work with, Charter, LTD, RUC. I mean, there's just all sorts of different companies throughout the state of Wisconsin that we have to work with. So it's a nightmare for us to manage some of these grants on our own. And even with some of the counties that you guys all deal with too, there's going to be a lot of complex kind of areas for that. So think about the planning, and that's going to be the proper planning leads to better projects. So and then to kind of go back on what everybody else is talking about with the GIS data, addresses, parcels, and building footprints are so huge. And I'll echo what Garen kind of said about building footprints too. Some of our properties, like our allotment properties, 200 people might own this property, but we might have 10 houses on that one parcel. So that one parcel is not going to let us know that there's 10 houses on it. And it could be one of those back 40s. It could be a property that's way in the back of the property. That's a lot more fiber. That's a lot more infrastructure material that needs to be built. And I would say for a lot of our tribal properties, that's probably going to be more the norm, that a lot of our tribal members have very long driveways in some very interesting areas to build out in. So historically, when tribes got property from the federal government didn't want to give them the best land possible. They didn't want to give them the land that you can sell or you can lease out for 200 acres or $200 an acre for cash crops. We got the swampland. So a lot of the properties that we have to deal with are in very kind of rough areas, and to know where these buildings are on these properties can be very important for these ISPs to figure out, or these other consultants to figure out, how are we going to build out fiber to these communities? How are we going to build out fiber to these homes? Proper GIS data is always going to be a very important thing for all of us. So I would say, to kind of wrap it all up, the biggest thing is just take partnerships. That'd be my recommendation for all you guys. Take partnerships and being the GIS data people. in your areas, start looking at where you have RDOF, start looking at where there has been PSC applications in the past, start looking at the different partnerships that you could potentially have, look at the different tribes, the different municipalities. Each one of these places and entities are going to have different funding available to them. Start working together, making these partnerships, and then you'll hopefully have a successful project. So that's about all it for me. We'll transition into Zach. Thank you, everybody.
Great, thanks, Nick. So with the last 15 minutes here, I'm going to focus on, this has been a great setup with all the presenters on the panel today. I'm going to focus on, once you have a project identified, you have your funding source in place, and now it's time to put fiber in the ground and design the network and get it constructed and turn up services. And so we'll take a look at, some of the highly detailed data that goes into that network design process. And so this is something we tapped into providing geospatial data to the telecom industry about 6 years ago. And it was really from a geospatial standpoint, getting good base mapping information into the hands of broadband service providers, primarily going in as a CLEC, into a competitive area and overbuilding, an aging copper network with fiber. And then just a couple of years later, we got into the actual OSP engineering or network design services through an acquisition of a firm. And it was just a real natural pairing for us. And since then, we brought this geospatial network design approach to a lot of pretty good size fiber to the home, fiber overbuild projects in Wisconsin and Colorado, Florida, and other places. So I think what was surprising to me when we started working in this world was that how much geospatial data that we all provide is relied upon for this process. And I guess it also surprised me how much it was not relied on too. How often it was boots on the ground and clipboards and cameras kind of thing, and just going out with large groups of boots on the ground and trying to collect this information. And so it was just a natural fit. And many providers, you heard Garen talk about it, how they've adopted GIS. Many telecom providers have adopted GIS or in the process of adopting it and tapping into these data layers. And the primary driver behind this is, its efficiency and its accuracy of the design process. So, it's really important when you start talking about deploying fiber is, there's a big investment up front by the service provider without any guarantees of return. And the service providers aren't getting paid until you have addresses turned up and you have customers online and subscribers. So that process from market analysis to engineering to construction to turning the lights on, it needs to be a very efficient process. And not only that, the design process needs to be done accurately, so that there's limited rework once you go to construction. All right, next slide. So I talked about this geospatial outside plant engineering approach, OSP. Really what we're talking about is taking fiber from the central office or a major node and taking it all the way to the premise. So it could be a business or it could be a home. And really the sweet spot for this approach is large overbuilds of existing networks, also large corridor transport projects. So that would be, taking kind of called long haul fiber, where you're going from point A to point B with a significant fiber, more like a transmission. If you think of electricity, you think of a transmission line to ultimately build out to distribution. Fiber to the home, and then any projects that are fast turnaround, which is pretty much all of them. Next slide. So the benefit of using geospatial data is it really feeds into all phases of the project. So we've heard a lot about planning. Where do we apply for funding. Where are we going to go? Where's our biggest return on investment? And doing that market analysis. Ultimately, you really go to what's called a high level design, where you're actually laying the network out, determining your quantity, approximate quantities, how many feet of fiber, and how you're going to distribute that out to the customers. That's kind of that first step, and geospatial data is really important for that high level design. Once that's complete, then you go to that high level, or you go to that next phase, which is the actual engineering phase. Ultimately, that design goes to construction, and then you have sort of the after the fact maintenance of that network with inspection, handling land records and real estate as well. So this data is used, from A to Z on these projects. Next slide. So what types of geospatial data are we talking about? Aerial imagery is certainly a great asset for base mapping. LiDAR comes into play when you start talking about what is the elevation on the top of the building, or what is the height of the pole from the ground, or what is line of sight. If you're talking about wireless, you're looking at, where do I need to put towers? Where do we need to put repeaters from a line of sight standpoint? But we've used a whole array of geospatial tools and techniques. We've used laser rangefinders to identify the point of attachment on the house, for example. Where does the service drop need to attach to? We've used georeferenced video capture to identify existing pedestal locations and cabinets and handholds for designing the network. So it's a whole array of geospatial tools that we need to have on hand, and then it just depends on the project and what's required as far as what we would use. Next slide. All right, so as we zoom in here, we're looking at highly detailed information. I guess the point here is you really have a whole array of phases of these projects or services that come into play with these projects. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I mean, you're really looking at, in this graphic, you're looking at the building footprint. You're looking at the highest elevation on that rooftop. All impervious surfaces are mapped. And then not only the road center lines, but the extent of pavement for the roads as well. And one of the key determining factors in the design process is whether or not you're going to put whether it's going to be aerial or buried facilities. And in most projects, it's a mix of both. But it's important to know where those impervious surfaces are, because if you are going to bury the facilities, then you need to, in these cases, do directional boring under the impervious surfaces because of the cost that it would be to break up those surfaces and then replace them. So you're trying to make a determination of where to go aerial. That is less expensive than buried, but then where it makes more sense to bury the fiber.
Hey, Zach, sorry to interject here, but in order to get our presentation started with a 5-minute break, if we could wrap up in the next couple of minutes or take questions, that's up to you. That'd be great. So to wrap up around 2:25 would be good. If we go over a little bit, that's fine.
Okay, I will fly through these and just stop on the important ones. So if we go ahead. Yeah, so first step of the process is we're mapping pole locations, top and bottom. Is important to know the height of that pole and where those are, so we can determine where the area facilities need to go. We'll step through these quickly. Second is extracting the edge of pavement. And I mentioned that we need to know where the edges of the roads are. So we map that out. Next up is impervious surfaces. So sidewalks, driveways, patios, things like that. We've heard a lot about buildings, building footprints with a centroid with the highest elevation. And then we also delineate those as either primary or secondary. We don't want to be designing fiber drops to the shed where the lawnmower is stored. We want to make sure that's going to the primary residence. Next slide. Okay, addresses are critical. We're relying typically on parcel data for addresses, but we know there's problems with that because you don't always have an accurate physical address. But that data set is critical for determining the customer base, the location, and also the really the public right of way is determined by using the parcel data as well at this point. Next slide. Another key aspect is identifying the public utility easements. So we'll go and retrieve all the plats, subdivision plats and CSMs, identify where the public utility easements exist, which is the path of least resistance really for design. And then we'll map those out in GIS and then link to a digital record of that plat or CSM so that can be used during the construction the design process for sure, but also during construction to say, yes, this is a public utility easement where we can be putting our facilities. And this is kind of the result here of the base mapping all coming together. And I want to kind of skip ahead to the end here in the last few minutes because this is okay, here we go. So this is kind of where everything comes together. You can see the roads, you can see the buildings with addresses. The yellow lines are the public utility easements. Orange triangles are pedestals. Orange lines are where it's conduit, where it's buried under the road here. The blue lines are aerial facilities. And you really see the notes. So there's some field review that goes into this. And then there's some redesign. Ultimately, you get to a final design, which is the next slide. So this is the level of detail that would be in a final design package that would go to construction. Okay, so you can see this is we're actually identifying, these are called ONTs, basically where the drop is attaching to the structure. Okay, so and you have splitter information on the pedestals, you have fiber information, but this whole package gets put together, and this is where it gets handed off to the construction contractor to build the fiber. So I guess my last comment in the last minute here is just all of the information that you've seen here is critical in deploying these, getting fiber in the ground or on poles and getting it functional and turned on. And I think Garen mentioned it, and we're working for service providers that are relying on this information every day to efficiently and accurately build out these networks. And if I had to answer Andy's question about which statewide layer would be the best or the most desired, I've got a whole laundry list of them, but building footprints, I would reiterate, physical addresses, information on those buildings about, we call them MDUs or MTUs, which are multiple dwelling units. So like an apartment complex, is it a 4-unit complex or a 2-unit complex? Public utility easements, public right of way, all those types of layers are really critical for the network design process.
I think we have time for one question if someone wants to bring one up live. Otherwise, I think over the break, we can answer your questions in chat.
I have one
Awesome.
question.
Go for it, Andy.
It's going to look like it's directed to Garen, and maybe it is, but Coulter, you can answer it too. Because I've seen this come up twice in 2 days now, this same comment. So on Garen's slide, it said high-speed broadband puts rural areas on a level or even better playing field than urban areas. So do we think it's fair that we're subsidizing broadband deployment to rural areas, to have better broadband than the urban areas, which, much of this funding is largely coming from taxpayers of urban areas. This is something I struggle with on the broadband task force a little bit. And I've seen this come up, like I said, it was on a counties association webinar on Monday. The same topic came up, that the guy on the half a block off the square in Madison is going to have worse internet than somebody out in Bayfield County or something like that.
Garen, go ahead and go first. I feel like anything I've got to say is going to be Coulter speculation, not PSC comment.
Yeah, I mean, in the question of fairness, it's hard for me to really nail that down. If you take into consideration the densities of these cities, so you have far more payers into any one of our networks, let's say in those dense areas, far better return, much easier to rationalize the investment in the area. You take for a very quick analysis, take a MDU, as Zach mentioned, maybe it's 100 unit MDU. I get 100 customers in there. They all pay the same amount. Placing a small bit of fiber into that, obviously my return is very quick. I take a single place like Nick mentioned, that's out at the swamp in the back 40 that I've got to build 3 miles to. I will never get that money returned on that person's monthly. So fair is subjective. If I was downtown Madison and I was a block off something and I'm looking at this and I'm saying, why don't I have fiber? I don't know how to answer that for them. I mean, they're within an area with tremendous density and tremendous opportunity. Is it fair to them? Perhaps not. Is it fair to the person out in the rural area that has, in reality, without a grant, without some sort of assistant, is probably never going to have anything? It seems pretty fair to them. So I think it's subjective.
And I'll add one more thing to that too. The thing that really kind of adds another layer to this is that these ISPs, when they get this grant funding, this is for the construction of the fiber. It has nothing to do with the maintenance of the fiber. So some of these rural areas where you have to build 3 miles out to get to these homes, there's still maintenance costs for those ISPs that they have to take on a yearly basis. And they're not returning that. They're not getting the return for $80 a month for the one home that they're providing service to. That maintenance cost is quite large, and there's no grant funding right now set up for that.
Yeah, I fully understand that, but again, it's a fair point. I mean, I understand it's gonna be harder to deploy in rural areas. It's just getting a little, people in some of the urban areas are starting to say like, hey, what's going on? There's hundreds of millions of dollars going out for broadband deployment in these rural areas because it's hard to deploy. And, I don't know if there's really an answer to it or what's, really what the question is. That's why this is so hard to do. Otherwise we wouldn't be having these meetings, right?
Right. So to throw in my 2 cents of Coulter speculation, Hayden shut me down when we need to shut down.
Now it would be nice, but if you make it quick.
Long story short, good luck. Looking at the PSC's access piece, yeah, our focus has been where is broadband lacking per the data period. That's a very access focused approach. And yeah, it's driven our work for a while and it's a chunk of what we've been doing within the task force. The other, not exactly newer, but as far as how new they've been part of our focus, cans of worms that we're starting to open up more are the affordability and broadband adoption questions. And that probably has not that those aren't issues in rural areas, but that's probably where you have a bit more of an urban footprint on the broadband question, because odds are, for competitive reasons, like Garen and Nick and others have brought up already, the infrastructure itself is probably going to be decent in most densely populated areas. I have not run into a discussion about a lack thereof in a densely populated area yet, but exceptions happen. My comments are done.
Good. Let's cut it off there. Thank you again to all our panelists. We really appreciate all the information that you're bringing to us. With that, if there's any additional questions, throw them in the chat. Hopefully the panelists can be there and answer them during break. We're going to head into break. It's going to be 5 minutes. We'll come back around 3:38. And at that time, we'll play our videos from our sponsors. So you'll know we're coming back when you see the videos from the sponsors.